struck at least 30 blows to her head and face.
She had fractures to her skull, cheekbone was broken. It's at times hard to fathom how another human could do that to another human.
Attacked in our own home and killed. The town was shocked.
He was deemed to be the most dangerous man in Britain. He was on the run and he was desperate.
The #1 priority was to locate him and catch him as quick as we could. He was a real risk to the public.
Nestled in the rolling hills of Northumberland lies the picturesque town of Hexham.
Hexham is a good place to be. It's a very established community, lots going on here. It's welcoming.
You walk up the streets, everybody speaks, everybody knows you. It's just a lovely town.
Hexham has a very close-knit community. It's exactly what you'd expect in a rural area.
It's also got a lot of farmland around it, a really good quality of life. It's regularly voted as one of the best places in the country to live.
It's quite affluent. It's a thriving market town with pubs, shops, everything you'd expect to find in a rural part of Northumberland.
It's got a beautiful cobbled market square, beautiful abbey, very quiet, low crime rate, not a great deal happens there.
But the peace in pretty Hexham is about to be shattered.
We received a call from a member of the public in Newcastle city centre, which was probably 30 miles from Hexham. The member of the public had been walking through one of the streets in the centre of Newcastle and had found a handbag on the top of a public bin on the side of a pavement.
They saw the bag and thought it was a bit odd because I think it was in quite good condition, and they took it and handed it in to the police as lost property.
It was apparent there were no valuables there, so the suspicion was it had been taken with the intention of taking whatever was in it.
The police searched the handbag to see if they could identify who it belonged to, and inside they found some ID.
The ID was in the name of 77-year-old Hexham pensioner Judith Richardson.
Officers were dealing with what they thought was just a lost bag.
The police in Newcastle got in touch with the police in Hexham, and the police in Hexham went around to the home of Miss Richardson to explain to her that her property had been found.
When the officers got to Hexham and called at Judith's address, they were expecting to find someone who would answer the call and probably say that the bag had been stolen.
But when police knock, there's no answer. With concerns about Judith's age, they decide to gain entry.
When they got in, they found Judith dead in the hallway of her flat.
It was clear from the injuries sustained, which were horrific, that, someone had done this. It was clear that it was a homicide because of the level of injury.
She had been struck at least 30 blows to her head and face.
And that's when they began a murder investigation.
I was head of the CID for Northumbria Police at that time. The senior investigating officer that was conducting the investigation at that point came to see me and briefed me about the occurrence. This was a completely random attack. We were simply presented with a body in the passageway of a house. We didn't have any idea at that time who the offender was.
Officers piece together what they can about who Judith was.
She lived on her own in a small flat in a very nice part of Hexham. She was just a normal, person living in the community and going about her daily business.
She had a very, very simple life. She didn't have any close family in the sense of children. She was a spinster and lived by herself with a dog. She was well known to the local church where she attended regularly. She was a real pillar of the community.
With nothing untowards in Judith's life, investigators turned to the scene of the crime.
The first things to do are to secure the scenes, and the scene at the address is the first scene where the body is, but obviously there's the corresponding scene in Newcastle city centre, which is the handbag and the bin. So we've got to take control of those scenes to then enable us to conduct inquiries in the right way so we don't lose evidence.
There's no evidence of a break-in, but it's clear drawers and cupboards have been ransacked, so forensic officers focus on items of interest to see if they hold clues.
On the floor of the hallway of Miss Richardson's home, when her body was discovered, was an Age UK leaflet. Fingerprint was discovered on it. A tissue was found that was stained with blood and found within the bedroom of Miss Richardson's home.
While the tissue and the leaflet are sent to the lab for tests, Judith's body is carefully removed and examined by a pathologist.
I was the crime scene photographer in the post-mortem. Judith was a 77-year-old woman. Reminded me of my grandma a little bit, and the attack was so severe, it is at times hard to fathom how another human could do that to another human. There were a lot of injuries to photograph. She had fractures to her skull, cheekbone was broken, there were lacerations and bruising to the brain, and she had a lot of bruising all over her body. And Judith had a number of kind of cuts and defensive wounds as well on her hands and fingers. It was really clear that the cause of death was from blunt force trauma. And there was some speculation at that time that it could have been caused by something like a hammer. I think everybody was quite shocked just at how brutal and savage this attack was.
Something like this would, and indeed did, send shockwaves through the entire community. It's totally unexpected. The ferocity of the attack was absolutely exceptional, and particularly to happen in a place like Hexham.
Couldn't believe that a little old woman would be attacked in this town, you know, just didn't know who was loose about. Oh, it was terrible. The town was shocked.
Investigators turn their attention to the place where Judith's bag was found, in the hope they can discover who may have dumped it there.
The senior investigating officer at the time made a really good call early on to obviously focus on the bin and the surrounding area, and in particular the CCTV that covered that part of the city, and try and lock down any CCTV, particularly in Newcastle city centre, that may overlook the bin in question. But it was really important that detectives were sent to secure any cameras from shops, business premises, from public CCTV on lampposts or whatever, to ensure that none of the evidence or potential evidence was lost. And then it was a case of trawling through to ascertain who put the bag on top of the bin. A little squad of officers were put onto the reviewing of the CCTV. One of the officers started by focusing on the bin at around the time that the member of the public had called it in. So working backwards from that time, there was only one camera, I understand, covering that bin, and it was a long distance shot with a very poorly pixelated image that showed the bin.
Something piques the detective's interest.
Looked like a bus had pulled up near to the bin. A number of people had gotten off the bus. Could that have been the time when the bag was discarded at the bin? That grainy image then necessitated a contact with the bus company, who could only provide, you know, a rough outline of lots of buses. You know, we didn't have one particular bus at a particular time on a particular street. So we were presented with, you know, quite a volume of CCTV, which has to be manually viewed. And it's a real arduous task. It's time-consuming, it's difficult, it's painstaking, but that's the basis of what good detective work is.
But the hard graft soon pays off.
On one of the buses, there was an image from the cab of the driver which saw a man get off at Clayton Street at the relevant point. And actually, as he gets off the bus, his arm moves to the left and he places what we now know to be the bag on top of the bin. The number one priority was to locate him and catch him as quick as we could.
In Hexham, Northumberland, 77-year-old Judith Richardson has been found bludgeoned to death in her own home. CCTV has been uncovered showing a man getting off a bus in Newcastle and placing Judith's handbag on a bin. Police need to retrace their suspect's steps to track him down urgently.
There were hundreds and hundreds of hours of CCTV which they had to check in order to track down this footage, which was of him on the bus.
So from that we got a description. The officers then went back in time and looked at the same CCTV from other cameras on the bus, and there in clear view, up the centre of the bus, sat in the middle, was the offender.
They had CCTV of him sitting on the back of the bus with the bag on his lap, which was absolutely crucial.
Not hiding it, in open display, and it was on camera. So that gave us the clue that he's probably the man that's committed this crime. From there was a huge amount of work went on. One, backtracking on the bus to see where he'd come from, but two, to follow through where had he gone after depositing the bag. Now that necessitated several cameras in the city centre to be cross-referenced and cross-checked, but we had a description from the clear imagery off the bus of this individual wearing a green shirt. And it was on different cameras on a different street that this individual was spotted going into a jeweller's shop. When officers then went to the shop, there was CCTV inside the jewellers, and there's the offender pawning or selling what turned out to be Judith's jewellery. Once it was identified that he'd been into this particular jeweller's, officers were deployed to go and conduct inquiries. They spoke to the owner of the store, who provided a ledger where he'd signed a name. G. Jarman. I think it's fair to say that when officers recovered the ledger and the signature in the name of G. Jarman, they didn't for 1 minute think that that would be the actual name of the person in question. I think everybody thought it would be a made-up name, but unbelievably, it wasn't. And G. Jarman became the focus of our attention at that time. The SIO conducted immediate inquiries on the police national computer and identified that he was a missing sex offender from the Durham area. He'd been arrested for a shoplifting offence a few days before the murder and bailed to court, but had not appeared at court. So that was an immediate trigger for Durham to then raise the alarm and concern about this individual, who was now known as Graham Jarman.
Investigators are shocked when they uncover Jarman's criminal history.
He was a very, very dangerous individual. Obviously, Durham Constabulary, which is the force next down south from Northumbria, They had been managing him as a sex offender, so an officer, a risk management officer, would have been regularly visiting Jarman. They were going to be the font of knowledge around who this person was, his background, his hobbies, his habits, his lifestyle. And that individual provided us with significant information to paint this very detailed picture of who we were actually dealing with. An incredibly dangerous man.
He was previously identified as the most dangerous man in Britain in the early 90s. He was guilty of the most horrendous sex crime, where he kidnapped a 17-year-old, put her in the back of a car, used a horrendous expression, "I'm your everyday psycho." He was also involved in a series of armed robberies, so he had a criminal career which dated right back to his early 20s, really. Bearing in mind he was in his 40s and even had spent most of his adult life in prison.
His previous convictions were horrendous. There was rape, kidnap. He'd been to prison several times for long stretches of jail time. I think 15 years was one of them, 8 years was another. To say that he was a dangerous individual was an understatement.
But as detectives discover, Jarman hadn't always followed a life of crime.
People who knew him from the 80s think that he seems to be a very different person from the one that they knew then to who became this really aggressive, violent man committing a lot of crime.
Graham Jarman had worked as a civil servant, as I recall it, and then something had plainly happened that triggered him into a world of not just criminality, but criminality of the most serious type. And I don't know, certainly for certain, what that thing was that happened in his life, although, like everyone I've seen, it reported that he had a particularly significant reaction to discovering that he was adopted.
This is when it's believed Jarman's life started to spiral out of control.
He used betting shops a lot, as far as I'm aware. He's had gambling problems.
He had a compulsion to violence and sexual offending and robbery because of his gambling addiction, and was prepared to do anything, and then just seemed to, you know, suffer the consequences, really.
He was a loner, he had no friends, he was quite articulate, he enjoyed reading broadsheet newspapers, but he was a horrible, nasty individual.
But police need to link Jarman with the place where Judith was killed, Hexham.
The guys then worked on the CCTV off the buses and were able to backtrack him to Prudder, which is another little area in Northumberland, and then from there he actually got off a bus from Hexham in Prudder, went into a shop, and then got onto this bus and into Newcastle. So it was in effect backtracking back into Hexham, which is what they were able to do.
To track Jarman's movements in Hexham, investigators speak to businesses with CCTV. Chris Dunlop's pub is on the main thoroughfare into the town centre.
Police came in, asked if they could use the cameras to have a look if anyone had walked past, because we have a camera on one side of the building, a camera on the other side of the building. And it was just by chance that he'd walked past this camera and he was on this camera, and they just thought he was a strange man, so they followed him. There's the camera there that caught him walking past on the road.
What we've been able to pull together from the compilation of the CCTV is that Jarman had indeed come to Hexham on the 17th. He'd stayed overnight in a guest house on the first night. On the second night, he apparently had slept rough somewhere in Hexham. And on the day of the murder, the Friday the 19th, he'd been seen walking up and down various locations in the centre of Hexham.
I think that the CCTV put him in Hexham, observing elderly women. From what's known now, potentially looking for victims, for targets. And I know that there was CCTV of him leaving a hardware store in Hexham and Judith was entering.
Police now have a link between Jarman and the murder victim. But that's not all.
In the period before the killing of Miss Richardson, he was caught on CCTV walking towards her home. And in the period after her killing, he was captured by the same camera walking away from her home.
Round about the same time that we received an update from the forensic services saying that we received a forensic hit on a fingerprint that had been found on an Age UK form that had been left in Judith's house. And that fingerprint also matched the name Graham Jarman.
Also, his DNA was found on a tissue that was blood-stained within the bedroom at her home where she had been attacked.
In the meantime, there's been another big development.
A hammer was found in a Aldi plastic carrier bag. It was found on the wall of one of the neighbours.
The hammer was examined and DNA was discovered on it.
Blood and hair found on the head of the hammer matches the DNA profile of none other than Judith Richardson. But Graham Jarman's whereabouts are unknown.
Once we come to terms with the fact that we've got a really serious offender with a background that is just unbelievably violent and aggressive, and whose mental state is such that, you know, he's been described as a psychopath, it's absolutely imperative to get a hold of the individual. So we had to try and track him down. To protect the public, he had to be captured very, very quickly.
In Hexham, Northumberland, 47-year-old Graham Jarman is wanted in connection with the robbery and murder of pensioner Judith Richardson. After finding his fingerprint and DNA at the crime scene, police need to track him down urgently. Jarman's mother tells detectives he hasn't been seen at their home in Consett, County Durham, for weeks.
I know that he lived with his mother at the time of the murder. It was quite a curious relationship in the sense that she gave him money to spend.
His mother controlled him to a great degree and stopped him from, presumably, to stop him gambling everything away. But it also became apparent that she'd left in the weeks preceding to go and visit family.
So his source of income had been lost. She'd spent his allowance because of his gambling habits.
And Jarman had actually stolen from his own mother. He'd taken a DVD player and sold it, and then when he realised the mother was coming back, that was his switch to say, time for me to leave. And that's when he started the offending.
Investigators launch a manhunt. They need to retrace their suspect's steps after he pawned Judith's jewellery in Newcastle.
He was followed on CCTV, getting into a taxi which we believe went to Gosforth, which is an area at the north of Newcastle, and his whereabouts thereafter were unknown. He would jump on buses and travel all over the area, but his background and his previous offending meant that this was really #1 priority for primarily North East forces. The first priority really was to come up with a press strategy, which then meant speaking to the media, getting the message out, identifying who he was with photographs and imagery that we had to get the public to be the eyes and ears for the police.
Journalists and reporters from all over the North East are enlisted to help.
We were called in for a briefing by Northumbria Police in order to explain the background to the case, the fact that he was on the run, the fact that they needed the public to try and keep an eye out for him in very simple terms, released a picture of him and appealed for assistance in tracking him down. He was deemed to be the most dangerous man in Britain, yet again having previously been identified as the most dangerous man in Britain in the early 90s. And as soon as his name became public, we were aware of the really horrendous background of offending, which he was guilty of and had been found guilty of previously, so that you knew you had a very, very dangerous individual who was out at large.
To add to the investigators' woes, Jarman is already one step ahead.
He was seen in a supermarket where he changed his clothing, so he was changing his appearance to make it much harder to track and find him.
We do know that he'd purchased a set of hair trimmers and he'd shaved his head to try and change his appearance. He was almost bald, or looked, you know, very closely shaven. The search was really about understanding him and trying to preempt where he was going to go. And what we thought was really important was to get the expert input from a forensic psychologist, which is what we did.
The reason they brought in a psychologist, although it sounds a bit like Cracker the TV series, was really to try and identify his motivations, his pattern of behaviour, what he was likely to do while he was on the run.
That psychologist came up to Durham and assisted with us. We spent hours with that individual, poring over who Graham Jarman was. He was able to paint this picture of the sort of mindset. He classed him as a psychopath plus.
The psychologist tried to identify what he might do next. He'd been living with his mum, so the chances were he was on the run and alone and was trying to fend for himself, really. Where would he get money from? Could he potentially target another elderly victim?
The psychologist was then able to build and draw and come up with a really detailed offender profile of Jarman, which didn't only look at his history, but almost got into his head and his mindset of what he'd be thinking, what he'd be concerned about, what he'd be planning. And from that fed into our strategy for press releases to the public. When we were asking the public, rather than just saying, this guy's wanted, please tell us if you see him, we had to provide something more, and we were able to do that. The profile indicated that he was transient. He would travel on public transport, in particular buses. He would go into bookmakers to place his bets, if he had any money, that was. He liked going into libraries where he would sit and read. So this all had to be passed out to the public to try and get them to engage and be really vigilant.
Soon, a result. There's a sighting of Jarman in a betting shop some 50 miles south of Newcastle, in Saltburn. Then, 2 days later, he's found on CCTV entering a supermarket 20 miles west, in Yarm. For the manhunt team, this is a worrying trend.
As the days developed, we received sightings, information from other forces that suggested he was transient and moving. He'd gone as far south as Cleveland, and we had sightings in Stockton and other places in and around that area, which brought Cleveland police into the mix. So we now had the three northeast forces, Northumbria, Durham and Cleveland, one on top of the other, going south, and it was apparent that Jarman was on the move. And there was reason to believe he was potentially going to commit crime as he moved down. And there was a suggestion that he was potentially going right to the southern coast to see family and friends down there.
Forces in the southeast are also put on high alert.
And that's when it was press the red button, and it becomes a really multi-force chase. We even contacted Sussex police at one point to give them the heads up that he may be on the way down, so they could start and advertise the fact that this individual may just suddenly appear on their patch.
There was information put out that people and the public should not approach him. It was recognition that he was a violent man, he was quite a dangerous man. They had more police presence in libraries. They put more presence around kind of betting shops.
There were meeting after meeting Hours and hours of research went into tracking him down. But every time we got a sighting, we were always that one step behind it. By the time we got the notification and went and checked the CCTV and confirmed it was him, he'd obviously moved. So it was frustrating. And not all of the sightings were actually of Jarman, and that was another frustration, and it always is on a manhunt like this, where every single request has got to be assessed, visited and checked out. We had several sightings that were Jarman, others were not and had to be discounted.
The manhunt team makes one final push.
We took the decision to really ramp up the media engagement and appeals to the public. And I took the lead on that in terms of conducting a number of interviews.
I'm appealing directly to the public and indeed to Mr. Jarman to give himself up.
I think I did about 14 individual interviews with different media outlets, local news, TV, newspapers, radio stations, to push this message and really go for it in a big way to try and get that message loud and clear to the public.
We need to speak to him as a matter of urgency.
Days later, news comes in from Yorkshire.
A librarian in Filey in North Yorkshire had heard the press appeal, had gone into work on Saturday morning, and she'd put Jarman's face, that was released in the media, on her computer screen as a screensaver, and got on with her business. And she was walking around the library that particular morning when, lo and behold, there's an individual sat reading a newspaper in front of her, and she realised it was Jarman, the very person we were looking for.
Obviously aware of the fact that he was dangerous, but aware of the fact that this fugitive was in her midst, she did exactly the right thing, immediately got in touch with police, kept an eye on him to make sure he wasn't going anywhere, and not give away any kind of suspicion at all, which is obviously crucial in that context.
2 local bobbies turned up.
I was sat in Filey Library, just minding my own business, and I was just sat there, and then the police came in. I was wondering what was going on, and it turns out that they were after the man that was sat next to me on the computer, who was actually terrifying, to be honest.
He gave a cock and bull story about it not being him. They called in their more experienced sergeant, who took none of it.
And he just stood up and went quite quietly, to be fair. He didn't kick off, didn't do anything, he just got up and left.
They promptly arrested him on suspicion of murder. And a live scan fingerprint check quickly revealed that we had our man.
In Filey, North Yorkshire, Graham Jarman has been arrested on suspicion of the murder and robbery of Hexham pensioner Judith Richardson. The 2-week manhunt, covering hundreds of miles across the northeast, is finally over.
It was an absolute relief to hear that news. I was delighted that he'd been captured, and to hear that it was in a library was the icing on the cake in terms of where we presumed he would be. There was a lot of pressure on us as a law enforcement agencies to actually get a hold of this individual. There was a massive threat and risk to the public. It would have been a real tragedy had anybody else been hurt or indeed killed. So I was absolutely delighted with the combined efforts of all the police involved in the various forces. But I've also got to say that was just half of the story. Catching him was one thing, but building a case against him was the real issue. Arrangements would have been made for Northumbria officers to go down to Filey, pick him up and transport him back to Northumbria, where obviously the SIO and his team progressed with interviews.
As I recall it, during the course of the extensive interviews that the police conducted with Graham Jarman, he did give an account of where he had been and what he said he had done.
And then, proceeded to give the various excuses about why he had the bag and belongings with Judith.
His account of the handbag was that he had been walking along the road where Judith Richardson lived.
He claimed that he'd simply been outside of Judith's property and saw the handbag lying on the wall and had picked it up, claiming that the real killer must have left it. Obviously, that was complete nonsense.
In the meantime, investigators uncover more evidence of Jarman's crime spree.
It turns out that a couple of offences had been committed by him. On the way down, I think he was either in Whitby or Bridlington, he'd gone to the coast and observed a young fella parking his car up, getting a surfboard off the roof of his car, and then putting a wetsuit on and going into the sea. Jarman saw that as an opportunity to break into his car and stole, amongst other things, a wallet with the young guy's identification and credit cards and things. He then went into a shoe shop where a lone female store attendant was present, and he robbed her of money. And on leaving that store, he dropped an identity card which was actually stolen from the car that he'd attacked when the surf had gone into the sea, which again I think was used to try and bluff his way when the officers arrived to speak to him at the library in Filey.
After 3 days of intensive interviewing, detectives believe they have a compelling case against Graham Jarman.
His DNA placed him at the scene. They had details of the journey to where the bag was dumped. They had CCTV of him dumping the bag. They had him on the bus with the bag. He gave his name when he went to the pawnbroker's note to sell Judith's valuables. The evidence against him was overwhelming.
The SIO and the team put the case to the CPS, and Jarman was charged with Judith's murder.
Paul Greeny KC is appointed to represent Jarman in court.
I have a clear recollection of my first meeting with Graham Jarman. What struck me about him was that he was plainly an intelligent individual and a clear-thinking individual who had his own ideas about his own case. So he certainly didn't present to me as an everyday psychopath. If you hadn't known what he had done in the past and what he was accused of doing, you wouldn't have guessed. He was straightforward, and certainly I didn't find him at all a difficult person to deal with. But at all stages, Graham Jarman denied that he was responsible for the murder of Miss Richardson and made clear that he intended to have a trial.
Graham Jarman finally faces justice at Newcastle Crown Court. He pleads not guilty to the murder of Judith Richardson.
He sits in court and he doesn't give away anything when the evidence is being outlined, because the jury are there, and obviously be aware of the fact that the jury are watching him, so tend not to show any emotion for obvious reasons.
The prosecution outlines Jarman's motive.
He was a gambling addict. He didn't have much money to his name.
The assumption is that he was simply looking for a victim in order to try and get a source of money, really. Prior to the murder, he was seen in Hexham, clearly targeting elderly people, elderly women, in order to rob them, basically.
But the prosecution sets out how Jarman clearly has violence in mind.
The CCTV played an important part in tracking him, leaving Beals, it's called, where he'd actually stole the hammer from. And I believe that's where they think that he spotted Judith as a target.
After following Judith home, Jarman waits outside, then charms his way in, pretending to be from Age UK, and accidentally drops the leaflet in the hallway.
It was a truly shocking attack. He brutally assaulted her repeatedly with a hammer.
He'd gone and started ransacking her property, and then he beat her for a second time,
leaving her dead in the passageway of a house.
It's believed Jarman cleans himself up at the scene, dropping the bloodied tissue containing his DNA. And then leaves with Judith's stolen handbag.
And the prosecutor made quite clear to the jury that the level of violence he used was completely, horrific, but also unnecessary given the context. He could have walked in, taken all the valuables and walked out. There was no need to take her life. Jarman didn't take the stand, and given the level of evidence against him, you can understand why that is the case.
We knew that we were facing a complex and difficult case. Graham Jarman was demonstrated to have been in possession of the handbag of Miss Richardson, and it was proved and indeed acknowledged by him that he had pawned some jewellery that belonged to her, getting £300 or about that for it, and even signing his own name for the receipt. Also, part of the case against him at trial was that he had changed his appearance in the period after the killing of Miss Richardson, to which his response was, "I'm a shoplifter and I regularly change my appearance so as to reduce the prospect of being detected for that crime."
The jury retires to consider its verdict.
The jury was in retirement for a number of days.
And eventually, the jury decided he was guilty of the said offence.
The SI owner's team had delivered excellent evidence. It was overwhelming.
It was inevitable that the judge would impose a very lengthy minimum term, which he did. A term of 35 years that Mr. Jarman will have to serve before he can apply for parole.
A very, very long sentence was given, and I don't think he'll ever be released. I don't think he'll ever deemed to be safe, even when he's an elderly man.
The brutality of Judith's killing still haunts her town of Hexham.
This was a targeted attack for financial gain. And the really sad part about that is that from what he got, he actually only got £300. So this brutal murder took place for £300.
I'm sure the people in Hexham would have had a really negative impact by this crime. It's very rare, certainly in a lovely area like the market town that is Hexham.
I do think that justice has been served for Judith, but I don't think that Graham should have actually been out in the community. He had a really long, violent history. Had he been in jail, then this crime may not have occurred, and I think that's the really sad part.